and welcome to The Brief. This is Wednesday's edition. I'm Elane Nordin Abdullah. Now, joining me shortly, crisis management analyst Nordin Abdullah to walk us through today's news. Later, I'll be speaking to LARS ERIK, Associate Director, Ipsos Public Affairs, to walk us through their latest press release on the vaccine mandates. Now, we begin with updates from this morning's Parliament session. The government does not recognize arbitration proceedings by the Court of Paris to pay out a compensation of 62.59 billion ringgit to the heirs of the Sultan of Sulu. The government says that this is because the appointment of the arbitrator, Dr. Gonzalo Stampa, has been revoked and is no longer legally valid. Now, in other issues tabled at the Parliament, the government is to review the subsidy mechanism for oil products in a more targeted manner to focus on the vulnerable and the needy. According to the Finance Minister, the government is absorbing the tenfold increase in petrol, diesel, and liquefied petroleum gas subsidies following the increase in crude oil prices. And from the Minister of Health, beginning the 1st of April, now everybody's sort of looking forward to this news, travelers entering Malaysia who are not fully vaccinated must undergo quarantine for 5 days. Meanwhile, only 1 million children aged 5 to 11 have been vaccinated out of the 1.63 million appointments sent since the 3rd of February. And we move on to East Malaysia. The Sarawak State Disaster Management Committee announced the Chitrawana cluster in the Kuching district after 21 individuals were confirmed COVID-19 positive. The results of 6 other individuals linked to the cluster is yet to be known. And next, registered voters for the Johor elections are advised to cast their ballots this Saturday following the time suggested by the Election Commission through the MySPR SEMA application. Now, this is a reminder for eligible voters to check voting information in advance through the official hotline and website. So you can go to the MySPR SEMA application for you to be able to check your allotted times. And now we move on to a segment. Joining us once again for his crisis brief is Nordin Abdullah. Nordin, thanks for joining us. Now let's take a look at the stories that are trending. And this is for the first point today, reopening safely, or hashtag reopening safely. Now, according to the Prime Minister, Malaysia will begin transitioning into the endemic phase starting the 1st of April. Now, everyone's looking forward to this, Nordin. The government will cut down the COVID-19 SOPs from the existing 181 to just 1. Senior Minister Dr. Sri Hishamuddin Hussein says the one SOP contains 10 requirements. Post the announcement, there seems to be a shift in energy. Nationally, are you seeing more positivity? What are you reading into this, Nordin?
Well, thank you, Elane. It's always good to be on the show with you. I think one of the good things about reducing the number of SOPs is going to be making life easier for everybody, and I think that's going to be a wonderful step for people who have been under siege in that sense for the last 2 years. Yes. And I think this is going to be a wonderful time for individuals to get out and about, and for me, I'm excited about what this means for mental health. I'm excited for what this means about for the tourism sector. I'm excited for what this means for business. So I'm hoping that we will see a drop in issues around mental health as people start to get out and about and be human again. And I think that's going to be one. And I think for me, the other thing that we will see a direct impact, which will be very quick, which will be in the tourism sector. Once travel is a lot easier for us and a lot faster for foreign visitors to get into the country, not just land in the country, but get through quarantines and all this kind of stuff. It will mean it becomes a better experience, and it's more like what we were used to before the pandemic. So we will see the tourism sector, and for me that is important for a few reasons. One is there's a massive amount of tourism assets in the country, but more importantly, it's going to drive jobs growth. And a lot of the crisis that we've been looking at over the last 2 years has been around employment issues, access to cash, access to funds. And the best way to give people access to funds is to allow them to earn their own money. And the tourism sector accounts for about 1 in 10 jobs, or did account for 1 in 10 jobs before the pandemic. And now we're looking to see that normalize. So it's an exciting time, and the government is doing their best to ensure that the SOPs are correct and also internationally benchmarked. So I think that's an excellent move.
I'm really looking forward to sort of the economic stimulus that this is going to bring, opening up the borders and allowing people to have lesser restrictions when coming in. It's going to create a lot more leeway for those who have, like you said, lost their jobs in the pandemic leading up to the COVID-19. And what are some of the at 181 to sort of just 10 requirements under one SOPs, do you think that was enough? Are you concerned about it? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think in terms of SOPs, I think we've all become very good at handling and dealing with the changes of SOPs over the last few years. I know there's been talk about how many there are now, how many there should be. And I think that's a good thing. The fact that there's plenty of discussion around the number of SOPs, around what the SOPs should be. We've seen a lot of consultation in different industry groups, different consultations, also looking at what's going on in social media. All of this comes into the decision-making matrix that the government has to make, weighed up against the health concerns and the economic concerns. So it's not just an A and B. We're talking about a matrix here. And I think when we talk about each SOP, it's looking at dealing with a specific threat. And what is the threat? It's a threat to our lives and a threat to our livelihoods. So the fact that there are plenty of people looking at these specific threats are very important in terms of crisis management and, of course, risk management and getting it right. It's one thing to open up the economy. It's one thing to open up the economy correctly. And I think we want it to be correct.
I'm actually lauding this move because I think it's high time, because we want to move towards endemicity. What that means is that it puts the responsibility and accountability back in the hands of the people to ensure that we are the ones that monitor, we are the ones that are taking care of each other, kita. The main idea is that we create an environment, a society, a community that's safe for each other, not waiting for an authority to say that this is what we can or cannot do. We should already know by this time what works, what doesn't, what we can and what we cannot do. Not saying that, but they didn't tell us this, we did it. So, throwing sort of the gauntlet back into someone else's court. Now we need to all step up as citizens of not just Malaysia, the world, globally, because we're opening our borders as well, to take care of each other. What are your thoughts on this?
Exactly, Elane. When you start talking about responsibility, you start talking about societal change, and you start talking about this idea of everyone taking care of each other, you start to get a different response. And whenever you start to look at designing a crisis response or designing a disaster response, the more that can be taken off the shoulders of the authorities, the more that can be taken off the shoulders of the government, and effectively move to the individuals. It shows a maturing process, and this is something that that I think Malaysians are ready for. And I think we will start to see the benefits of taking this approach. Of course, there's always teething problems, and one thing that we've noticed over the last 2 years, the government is always good at making fine-tuning SOPs or fine-tuning areas that need addressing after it doesn't or doesn't work out the way that was initially intended. But that's part of the process. This is not COVID-19. There was no handbook created with the virus.
It's an evolving thing, right? It's an evolving thing. Now,
exactly.
I want to quickly touch on this before we run out of time with you. The Golden Passport. The European Parliament approved a report urging the EU to ban the Golden Passport schemes by 2025 and immediately stop the issuance of visas and passports to rich Russians in exchange for investments. Can you perhaps explain this, what this claim is?
Well, Elane, I think this is more a part of the information war than the economic war. And we talk about Russian oligarchs. Of course, there's a few famous ones, and there's a few that move from behind the scenes.
The war in Ukraine puts the spotlight
the
on
question
this
is how impactful will this move be? Will it create more problems for those destination countries, or will it actually start to put the pressure back on Russia? In terms of their incursion into Ukraine. So the other thing is how influential are the oligarchs in terms of dealing with the Russian president is also questionable. So we also know that from a unwinding this perspective, a lot of these the wealth of these high net worth global citizens. You're talking about layers and layers of corporate structures, layers and layers of foundations in some cases. So the passport, will some countries do decide. Of course, it's a sovereign right who you issue a passport to. But I think this is more of an emotional knee-jerk reaction than anything that's actually going to have a direct impact on President Putin's, his own matrix of thinking in terms of what is going on in Russia.
Thank you so much, Nordin, for sharing your thoughts on the crisis brief today. Now we will, of course, follow the evolving scenario, both of the Ukraine-Russia war, as well as the opening up of the borders and how it's going to be able to create the stimulus in the economy that we'll be looking forward to. Thank you, Nordin, for sharing your thoughts. That was, of course, Nordin Abdullah, our crisis management analyst. Now, we continue with trending business news. The ringgit rebounded to trade slightly higher against the US dollar. As of broadcast time, $1 is 4 ringgit and 18 cents. Now, the Bursa has maintained its high note at midday, lifted by banking and technology stocks following the overnight rally on Wall Street. At lunch break, the FBM KLCI increased 16.22 points to 1,578.55. And here's a quick update on gold prices. The physical price of gold was 265.92 ringgit per gram. On to some local economic news. According to a World Bank economist, the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine appears to benefit Malaysia as a net oil exporter and the sharp rise in oil prices, and will provide temporary support for the country's fiscal position. So that's good news indeed. And globally, the International Energy Agency is ready to bring more oil to the markets by releasing additional stocks. Oil prices are rocketing, stoking fears of supply disruptions to an already tight market. And now in focus today, we have made huge strides in our inoculation program. To help us understand where we are, I'm joined by LARS ERIK Lee, Associate Director, Ipsos Public Affairs. He's going to walk us through their latest press release on vaccine mandates. Hello, welcome, Lars. Thanks for joining us here on The Brief. Pleasure to have you. I'll dive straight into our first question, Lars. In your latest press release, COVID will be around for a while, and this has been spoken of quite regularly. This is something most people already know, but how should we start reconciling with this fact, Lars?
Okay, thanks a lot, Elane, for having us on The Brief to talk about this. Really appreciate that. So the data here, it comes from a global study that Ipsos did back in February across 30 countries, including Malaysia. So first of all, I think it's clear by now that COVID is quite resilient, right? So I think there's been quite a few times where it has looked like we were over a peak. And then we had to deal with new variants, like first Delta last year, and then Omicron towards the end of last year. So I do think that based on what we see in our data, people in Malaysia and the world have started reconciling with the fact that we have to live with the pandemic for a while. So during earlier times, we were talking about when the pandemic would be over. I think now it's more about how we manage to live with it. So in our latest data, we see that across the world, 71% of people think that we will not be able to fully stop the spread of COVID. And in Malaysia, it's even higher. So 75% of Malaysians think that we won't be able to completely get rid of COVID. So it's quite a common sentiment across most countries. I think, as we can see here, one outlier is China, where about half think we can stop the spread. But of course, it's a bit dependent on the context. China has had a bit of different experience in that sense, that they actually managed to stop it at various points. But I think the bottom line here is that people have kind of stopped thinking about COVID as something that will go away completely. So from here on out, it's more about managing it. So that's what we're seeing in our data.
I think we're seeing a lot more, I wouldn't call it normalcy, but people going back to some kind of activities that we formerly used to do. Like, Malaysia is opening on the 1st of April with allowing borders reopening, travelers coming in. So there's some sense of, going back to what things probably were, not in the same way. We still have SOPs in place. We're learning to live and deal with those SOPs as part and parcel of life now. It's no longer peculiar to see someone with a mask, to keep a physical distance apart, to eat separately, to go to make appointments to see and do things. So I think it's a more structured life that we are getting used to right now, and a more conscious way of being, so that we're keeping each other safe. So the next question is, we're talking about all the variants, right? There's always a new variant. We always say that once you know of one variant, there's probably another variant that's brewing at the back. Now, Omicron, of course, is in its peak in Malaysia, but your latest press release also highlights that it is receding globally. What reassurances can we get from this statement, and what can we learn from countries that are getting back some semblance of normalcy?
Okay, so I think that Malaysia has been a little bit behind the curve, right, in terms of Omicron. It started to emerge in some countries back in December, some big waves in January, and here it seems like we're in the middle of the peak now. So I think one of the good news that we can gather from other countries is that it hasn't come with quite the same degree of severe outcomes that we saw earlier in the pandemic, right? So we know that. And another thing, more from a public perception perspective, another thing we can learn from other countries is that the peaks that we've seen after Omicron emerged has not quite brought the same level of concern among the population as we saw during previous waves. So I think the emergence of Omicron back in the final months of last year, right, it came as a bit of a shock. And we saw that brought some concern, another variant. However, there was some early positive signs that it didn't have quite the same severity. So we have also tracked in Ipsos since early in the pandemic, back in March 2020, how concerned people are around the world about COVID. And we also tracked that here in Malaysia. So what we saw, that the concern about COVID here in Malaysia, it kind of peaked during the middle of last year, when we were in the middle of the Delta with the lockdown and so on, and then started to recede as the country started to open again. So we saw a slight increase in concern in December when the news of Omicron was fresh, even if it hadn't necessarily reached here yet, right? So after that, the concern here has dropped again and was actually at its lowest point since the start of the pandemic in February. So that happened as the cases was rising here, right?
I think we also have a bit of a fatigue as well. Now, I want to go on to the last question before we run out of time. Your survey says with vaccine mandates globally, Malaysia stands out. Can you walk us through these numbers? How are we doing?
Yeah, sure. So we asked a couple of things in our survey. Firstly, how people viewed making vaccines mandatory, whether it's above a certain age or simply if anyone is eligible to get one. And also whether people think proof of vaccination should be enforced for certain things like large events or going to work, going to a restaurant, traveling, and so on. So what we saw in our data is that in Malaysia, there is generally quite a high acceptance for these kinds of measures. So Malaysia is one of the highest countries in terms of supporting mandatory vaccination and the usage of vaccine certificates. So broadly, 80% of the population or more support any of these measures. So I think it's a couple of reasons for this. Obviously, we have been living with using Maiyukh from an early stage of the pandemic. So we have to check in, and showing the vaccination status is kind of an extension of that, right? And we also know that Malaysia have very high vaccination rates among the adult population. So I think showing proof of vaccine, it feels less of a burden and quite a small price to pay. And a second thing is that it's also of a cultural aspect. So not just in Malaysia, but other Asian countries such as Singapore, such as China, India, the level of acceptance is quite high. I think it reflects kind of a common sentiment that you have to pay some price for the benefit of society. And it's quite different from what we see in some other countries, specifically in the West, which are slightly more individualistic. So these kinds of measures, they're more contentious, in some places being politicized as kind of an infringement on people. Yeah. So all in all, even if now hopefully we go towards some easier times with regards to the pandemic, our data suggests that Malaysians would accept some minor inconveniences, such as proof of vaccines, as quite a small cost of opening up.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think the vaccine resistance and hesitance has sort of slowly faded away, and everybody is sort of accepting and wanting to go back to being able to create livelihoods for themselves and to be able to enjoy each other's company, because like it or not, you can only go online for so long. You still want to have a face-to-face communication. Thank you so much, Lars, for sharing your thoughts with us today. And Lars ERIK Lee, Associate Director for Ipsos Public Affairs, was speaking to us. Ipsos is a multinational market research consulting firm, and we were discussing vaccine mandates. Now, on to international news. WHO confirmed at least 10 deaths, while 16 are left injured in the 18 attacks on healthcare facilities in Ukraine since the start of the Russian invasion on the 24th of February. With the war in its 14th day, the number of refugees fleeing Ukraine have surged to 2 million in what the UN describes as one of the fastest exoduses in modern times. Head of WHO's Emergencies Program warns that the exodus raises the specter of a regional health catastrophe. The conditions in Ukraine have amplified the spread of infectious diseases. Now, that's another update of the Ukraine conflict. The US has decided to stop its supply of combat aircraft to Ukraine, claiming it would be a high-risk move that could raise the chances of a Russian escalation with NATO. Meanwhile, NATO ally Poland surprised Washington with a public offer to transfer its Russian-made MiG-29 fighter jets to a US base in Germany, an assistance the Americans believe will provide little gain. And previously, the US sought to speed weapons deliveries to Ukraine, but shuddered at the prospect of flying combat aircraft from NATO territory following Russia's warning that countries offering airfields to Ukraine for attacks on Russia may be considered entering the conflict. Meanwhile, Russia demands US to explain its alleged biological warfare laboratories in Ukraine involving deadly pathogens, including plague and anthrax. Both Ukraine and the US denied such allegations, calling the claims absurd. While Russia claims to possess documents attesting Ukrainian Health Ministry to have ordered the destruction of the pathogen samples, the authenticity of any such documents couldn't be proved. Now, on to news from across the ocean. This Friday marks Japan's 11th anniversary of the country's worst nuclear accidents, causing earthquake and tsunami, leaving more than 20,000 people dead or missing. The public remains wary of nuclear power after the 2011 disaster, highlighting major failings in oversight and operations. And Japan is still heavily reliant on liquefied natural gas and coal, with only 5 nuclear power plants operating, down from 50 before the disaster. And on to Syria. Syria's war has escalated in previous months with intensified shelling and aerial bombing by Syrian and Russian forces on rebel-held areas. The UN Commission of Inquiry urges the West to ease its sanctions on Syria to allow more humanitarian aid and mitigate the impact on civilians grappling with shortages. They also urge the US to carry out thorough probes into civilian casualties caused by US airstrikes in Syria to ensure that those responsible for any violations are held to account. And Kim Jong-un announced that North Korea will launch a number of observatory spy satellites in the coming few years to monitor military actions by the US and its allies in real time. According to experts, the move may prove controversial as the country uses the same banned ballistic missile technology for its recent nuclear weapons tests. And trending on Twitter today is sports headlines on Twitter today with hashtags on badminton. National badminton player Li Zijia garnered large support from the netizens on Twitter today with pouring encouragement following his performance at the German Open. Hashtag Li Zijia, hashtag German Open 2022. And that's all from me today. Thanks for joining us here on The Brief. Now we have only one SOP and 9 simple guidelines. Thanks for staying with us on The Brief.